Hello, and welcome to the very first RMF Healthy Pet Pod. In this edition, I will be talking about a very popular herbal remedy that I've seen recommended by so many people who are inclined to use so-called natural remedies, and that is slippery elm. So that'll be one of the topics here. And I will also be critiquing an article I received recently in a raw feeding influencers newsletter. And just by the way, I contacted her about this article and told her that I really wanted to pursue a dialogue with her about it because I wanted to understand it, and I wanted her to sort of justify what she was recommending. And I told her that I was doing this for the purposes of sharing it with my community. And she promptly just removed me from her email list. So I don't get those to use as fodder anymore for my live streams and podcasts, which is kind of unfortunate. But it's not that there's a lack of fodder out there. There are a lot of people who claim to know a lot about nutrition for dogs, spouting a bunch of nonsense. So there's never any shortage of stuff to talk about. So for this episode, slippery elm is in my crosshairs. And most people think of slippery elm as an herb, but it's not an herb at all. It's actually made from the bark of a tree called the Ulmus rubra, which grows in North America. And what makes it kind of special is that it has what they call mucilaginous properties, which means it becomes a thick, slimy goo when it's powdered and added to water. For this reason, it's thought to coat a sore throat or an irritated digestive tract. In order to do that, this goo must survive the digestive process to some extent, so it can't be digested. And that can only mean it does not readily break down, even in the very acidic fluids of the canine digestive system. But of course, acids wouldn't have much effect on this carbohydrate plant matter anyway. But this slippery elm stuff is claimed to heal certain common ailments in dogs and humans. But as I mentioned, what it really does is coat the tissues with this gooey slime. Since it prevents direct contact with whatever it is in the digestive tract that is causing irritation to the tissues, it is said to heal those tissues. But what's really going on is it's providing a barrier, and it does not only do this to the targeted tissues, but to the entire digestive tract, of course. So if a person takes slippery elm because chronic heartburn has caused inflammation or damage to their esophagus, as it often does, this stuff, slippery elm, will coat those tissues and may prevent further damage. But here's the problem. The problem is that it doesn't stop there. It also coats the inside membranes of the entire digestive tract that are required to remain sensitive and intact in order to function. The small intestine, for example, is supposed to be semi-permeable. It's got little holes in it in order to send nutrients out to the rest of the body. How is it supposed to do that with a slimy substance coating its lining? It would be like pouring slippery elm through a mesh strainer and then trying to strain a liquid through it. Very likely not much is going to get through. So same thing happens in the small intestine. In the perception of the medical profession, this presents the biggest problem when it comes to drugs, because when you look up the side effects of slippery elm, the only thing that comes up is that it may interfere with the uptake of medications that are taken orally. But what this really means is that it's going to interfere with the uptake of anything that's taken orally, even food. And eventually, the body will have to slough away all of this slimy goo, and the liver and kidneys will have to neutralize and filter the impurities. Now, the people who love to push this stuff and talk about how it heals will never tell you the truth about it, because the body is doing all the healing, and all we've done is further burden it with another eliminative task. It already had enough to do in that area in the first place. But instead of putting this goo between the tissues and whatever is irritating them, why not remove the source of the irritant? In the case of humans whose esophagi and other upper digestive tissues are inflamed from acids, all they need to do is stop eating acid-forming foods, and then the acids will not be created and the tissues will heal without burdening the liver and kidneys with the elimination of the slimy goo. And as I mentioned before, the cost doesn't end at just adding to the eliminated burden with this goo that has to be gotten rid of. It is also felt in wasted nutrients that will not be digested because of this barrier. Everything that's eaten is going to be much less efficiently taken in. So it's interesting that the people who push slippery elm, like the person that I watched in this video, and I will link to the video in the description below. They talk about the nutrients in slippery elm. Isn't that silly? These nutrients are readily available in foods that do not inhibit absorption of the nutrients of other foods and do not burden the body with their elimination. I should say unduly burden the body. Every food creates some waste, but it's that extra elimination we're trying to avoid. These appropriate foods taste good, look good, make us feel good, don't unduly burden our bodies with their elimination, and they do not require as much processing as slippery elm goes through, processing in the body and processing before it gets to you. The remedy known as slippery elm undergoes a lot of refinements before it shows up on store shelves. Now, another thing you will see when you pull up side effects is that some people are said to be allergic, quote unquote, to slippery elm. But this is absolutely not the case. A person or dog cannot be allergic to something that does not belong in the body in the first place. Some people and some dogs may be more sensitive to poisons than others, stuff that doesn't belong there. And that's always the case with anything taken internally that doesn't belong there. And it very well could be that those with the most vitality are going to react the strongest to these substances because their bodies have the energy with which to reject that which will harm it. So it's not a weakness, it's a strength. It's a sign that their body is able to reject anything that doesn't belong there. And as usual, if you try to research this stuff, you'll get pages and pages of how great it is from so-called holistic practitioners who conveniently also sell it. The only exceptions are the allopaths whose bottom lines are threatened by the selling of natural remedies. But on these medical sites, we find that what we find is probably more accurate because at least it's skeptical about this stuff. And it's interesting that these allopaths always reserve their skepticism for natural remedies, and they don't cast a skeptical eye at all on the stuff that they sell. But some of the things that they're going to say about slippery elm are absolutely true. It just needs to be said for pretty much everything that they're selling as well. So that's what I have to say about slippery elm. I will post the link to the video I watched below in the description if you want to have a look at that. And the next topic that I wanted to talk about, I didn't mention this at first, but I did want to report the results of a poll that I took in the big RMF group. And that group has 21,000 members in it now. So we got quite a bit of participation from people there. And my tumor poll basically asked what people saw as a result of their dogs being on RMF if their dogs had tumors going in. And here's the breakdown of what we got. 30% or 10 votes, I think there was something like 34 total votes. 10 votes or 30% said the tumor completely went away. 9 votes said the tumor stayed the same. That's 27%. Another 9 votes said the tumor opened up and drained, and that's another 27%. And 2%, or just one person, saw a tumor get bigger. 2 votes, 6% of the respondents said the tumor got smaller. And 3 votes, or 8% of the respondents, said the tumor changed, but it didn't go away. So what this looks like for RMF is it looks very good. I don't think you could poll any other group of users of any certain protocol and find any better outcome than this, even keto. And keto gets so much favoritism in the popular media and in social media as well. But even with anything that from the allopathic perspective that is intended to decrease tumors or shrink them, I don't think that it would do this well. And you have to think about what the body is being burdened with that remedy, because chemo is pretty much intended to bring down the size of tumors and the incidence of tumors, and it may well do that. But the problem is that it poisons the body in the meantime, in the process. And this is extremely positive. It's extremely overwhelmingly positive outcome. And it could be said that the people who saw favorable things happening in their dogs are more inclined to respond. So it's not a scientific poll by any means, but for 30 out of 34 to see either nothing happening at all or improvements or having the thing go away is extremely positive. And on that same thread where I did this poll, I just wanted to read a little testimonial from a member because I thought it was so remarkable. She said, quote, "My Frenchy girl's throat looked like someone had put half a tennis ball under her throat. The vet said it would cost $10,000 to completely remove all of her salivary glands. She prescribed pills that made the dog worse, and I feared that she would die. That is when I found and started RMF nearly 2 years ago. By the way, she was completely back to normal after 5 days of fasting," unquote. So with that, we have a little bit of insight about why the medical industry is so ignorant and fearful of fasting. They have very good reasons to be ignorant about fasting. But $10,000, like $10,000 isn't loss enough. What about the suffering to the dog? What about the cutting, the recovery, and the loss of her salivary glands? It's not like salivary glands don't have purposes. Salivary glands secrete that very lubricating fluid that allows food to be transported from all the way from the mouth to the stomach in a dog's body. They're not optional extras. They're not additional organs or dispensable organs. They are required. Okay, now the rest of this podcast will be dedicated to an article that I was sent by in a regular newsletter from Mariah Hope, and she has a website called Paws of Prey. She has a very active YouTube channel as well. And the article starts out with, I'll just start reading it. It's about, well, I won't tip my hand. It is about something we talk about a lot in RMF. But she starts out the article by saying, quote, "This animal-based ingredient is often deemed bad in human nutrition. And unfortunately, that way of thinking has seeped into pet nutrition as well. It will cause diabetes. It will cause heart disease. And for pets in particular, it will cause pancreatitis. Do you know what it is yet? Fat," unquote. So she revealed what the subject of the article is. And she is acting like she's getting ready to bust a myth, like those things aren't true about fat. But it's not a myth at all, because the idea that animal fat is bad for humans is absolutely objectively true. And I've explained many times, you guys might want to go back and watch the videos that I've done before on adopting a keto or a fat-centered diet and why that seems to have short-term benefits to some people. And whether or not that happens with some people, it is absolutely objectively true that animal fat is bad for humans. Unfortunately, fat in general and animal fat in particular are currently enjoying an undeserved, very favorable reputation among large swaths of the population, thanks to the media, especially social media. Everyone and their brother out there is adopting a keto diet and proclaiming to the world that they've been lied to by their doctors about how harmful animal fat is. And I suspect that when I see this kind of information being put out by raw feeding influencers like Mariah and Kimberly Gauthier, and many others, by the way, it's because they're buying into the fat fad for humans. And there are so many other raw feeding advocates that I have more than a suspicion to suspect that that's the case, that they are into fat eating themselves and they want to think good things about it. So wishful thinking takes over, and that happens all the time when people want to support their addictions, when they don't want to look at their addictions. Almost all humans on Earth are addicted to fat, and it's a very easy thing to convince yourself that something is healthy if you really want to eat it. Animal fat most definitely does cause diabetes in humans, heart disease in humans, and pancreatitis in humans. And it does the same thing in dogs, although dogs can tolerate a lot more of it than humans can. And the article continues, quote, and even vets warn others about feeding animal fat because we've seen pets come in with pancreatitis after eating it. So is this true? True. Should we trim all of the fat off of the meats we feed our pets? Well, let's think about that for a second, unquote. And this gets right to the heart of RMF, right? I don't think that Mariah really thought about this at all, even though she said she was going to, because if she had, and at least if she would have thought about it objectively, she would have been more impressed with the photos that I sent her that show graphically the difference in fat content between wild animals and agricultural animals. How could you claim that that lamb heart and the kangaroo heart in that photo that I share in the book are equivalent? This reveals an obvious problem. There's something there in the lamb heart that's farmed that is not there in wild prey. And that's going to cause a problem for our dog. She doesn't recognize that. That kangaroo heart that has no fat surrounding it, that's the kind of food that our dogs evolved eating. And we can't argue with millions of years of evolution and adaptation. That's all out of our hands. It was put in place long before we came along. So she continues with her article, quote, for us humans, what food source gives us energy? Carbohydrates. This is the main energy source us humans utilize when we exert energy. We are omnivores, so our bodies do a good job converting carbohydrates into energy, unquote. Well, right off the top here, humans are absolutely not omnivores. This is so easily demonstrated, and this is just one misconception that the study of canine nutrition is keeping Mariah stuck in. Dogs are actually much closer to omnivory than humans are, and these theories that nutritionists are taught in their training have far-reaching influence over the rest of their thinking about nutrition for both humans and dogs. So it gets kind of conflated. The way dog nutritionists think about the human condition and that we are omnivores actually ends up influencing what they think dogs should be classified as. And they are more likely to put them strictly in the carnivore camp if they do that, mistaken thinking about omnivory for humans. And this is exactly what Mariah does, because she continues by saying, quote, but what about carnivores? Carnivores do not naturally eat grains and legumes. And actually, both canines and felines have absolutely no dietary carbohydrate requirement, unquote. Humans don't have to eat grains and legumes either, but it's true that carnivores have no need of carbohydrates. I've said this many times. Carnivores can manage just fine without carbohydrates. The tundra wolves have very little opportunity to eat anything that grows from the ground. Not much grows there. So to continue on with her article, she says, quote, "So what do they need to use as an energy source? Fat." So that's her answer, fat, unquote. Nobody's denying that dogs use fat for fuel primarily and carbohydrates secondarily when they eat them. The issue is that domestic dogs are eating animals that are fattened beyond what nature would allow an animal to carry in the wild. Compounding that is the fact that domestic dogs are nearly sedentary. As I pointed out to Mariah in my email, the most active working domestic dog is more sedentary than the least active wild wolf, and they eat very lean animals. Wolves eat very lean animals. What are domestic dogs supposed to do with all this very dense fuel in the form of fat? And that's to say nothing of the residues that are stored in the fat of agricultural animals. What's that going to do to the kidneys and the other eliminative organs? Domestic dogs can't use it, so it comes out their ears and skin, and that's just excess food. That's not taking into account these residues. And it forms plaques, cysts, and tumors, among many other pathological responses in the body, of course. So the article continues. It says, quote, "Animal fat is a carnivore's necessary form of energy. This is what their body utilizes best. So when you're making a homemade raw diet, feeding fat is non-negotiable. But what about the pets that get pancreatitis after eating fatty meat? Well, I can only speak from experience. But when I worked as a veterinary assistant, every time we saw a pet come in with pancreatitis from eating fat, it was cooked fat," unquote. Now, fat and protein are both necessary equally in the diets of carnivores. And there is a proportion of each that is dictated by nature that they adapt to according to the environment they are born into. And that's true of all species, even humans. When this proportion, this macronutrient proportion is changed, there are going to be negative effects in the carnivore's health. Every single raw feeding expert I've come across, including this one, has failed to recognize this important fact. I don't think there is any validity to this idea that only cooked fat is responsible for pancreatitis. In my experience, cooking meat generally decreases the fat in it because the fat usually melts away. I'm quite sure I've seen dogs get pancreatitis even when they're raw fed. Cooked fat is definitely more harmful than raw fat, but raw fed dogs not only get pancreatitis, they get other diseases as well that I, at least, theorize are caused by fat. My last dog's ear issues stopped after I drastically lowered his fat intake. You guys know that story. And I've seen this consistently in other dogs as well. And the last paragraph of this article says, quote, "I personally knew a girl that adopted a dog with a history of pancreatitis, but she was determined to get him on a raw diet. She fed a lean DIY raw diet at first, but slowly increased the fat until it was about 8% of the diet, which is the average percentage of fat for raw diets for adult dogs. And as far as I know, he has not had pancreatitis since switching to raw. Now, even if your pet doesn't have past issues with pancreatitis, it's still a good idea to keep an eye on the fat in the diet because too much or too little of anything isn't good," unquote. Well, part of the problem in comparing my ideas to Mariah's is that she, as is illustrated in this paragraph, insists on using weight to quantify fat, just like the commercial pet food producers do. She does not understand that this is a device that has been used by them to make the fat content of their products look low. It might also be a device that they are using for objectivity, because weight is a more reliable predictor of what's actually in the product than caloric percentage. But caloric distribution is the important information for us. It's no surprise that this person, Mariah, hasn't figured this out, because she's on the inside of that system, that nutritional canine nutrition system. You'll never be able to see it objectively unless you step out of that system. We RMFers know that weight is meaningless when it comes to measuring fat, because what do we know about fat? Yes, even though it is very light in weight, it is extremely fuel dense, and that's the problem with using weight, because fat does not weigh as much as the other macronutrients. I've mentioned before how meaningless weight is with regard to measuring fat for the purpose of arriving at a macronutrient ratio that actually works in practice. A macronutrient ratio may seem mysterious, but it's just the proportions of foods that constitute either protein, fat, or carbohydrate. You guys know macronutrients are those three things: protein, fat, carbohydrate. Macro means big. You will hear me using percentages just like Mariah does, but when I use a percentage, it's part of the caloric distribution. This allows us to see just how much fuel dogs are getting from every macronutrient, and to make sure that the ratio is correct. The correct macronutrient ratio for dogs is something like 2/3 to 1/3, or 66% protein to 34% fat. That's very difficult to achieve, even if you trim fat from the meats that you feed. So I hope you've enjoyed this debunking premiere of the RMF Healthy Pet Pod. If you have any questions about anything I talked about today, or if you have a suggestion for future topics on the podcast, please submit them. I'd love to hear from you, either with the form on the website, or by email, or by posting on the Facebook group. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.